collecting inventory and creating simple collections. All right, we're finally starting to get to the interesting stuff. Up until this point, we've just got the basics down. We've got the discovery piece down, and that's sort of very simplistic. And we got the clients installed, which was hard, but not any fun. And now we're finally getting to the point where we can actually start to benefit from all the work that we've put into this system. So inventory, as you recall from when I talked about it before, is kind of the second half of that whole data collection piece. If we start with discovery information, we're eventually going to make our way to inventory information. Now, what's interesting is that with this inventory information, we can also then sort of take inventory information and turn it into asset intelligence. Asset intelligence is it arrived in 2007, and it's now sort of made a little bit more useful, I guess, in 2012. Asset intelligence turns the raw software inventory stuff into actually usable data. So think about that, right? So a software inventory, what is it doing? Really, what's it doing? It's kind of just going and looking at all the files on the disk and seeing what the properties of those files are. Now, knowing that you have winword.exe on the disk is nice if you know that winword.exe corresponds with Microsoft Word. And knowing that winword.exe is nice if you can look at the properties of that and look at the version to assume that you've got version, winword 14 or 15 or whatever version you want for the right version corresponding with what you need to install. The real meat in all of this happens when you take all that asset information, the file-specific information, and then convert it into asset intelligence, which is that final step, converting winword.exe at a certain version number into Microsoft Word version 2010. So that's the kind of the three steps really in this whole process. Now, when we have all that asset stuff, why we're collecting inventory is not only because we want to have the inventory, but also because we want to use that inventory for the creation of collections of objects that we're going to use for doing things. The hardware inventory is nice, and you will use it for viewing what's called Resource Explorer inside of Config Manager. You can see how many sticks of RAM you have in a piece of hardware, but really it's kind of the software inventory that helps you determine this machine has this application loadout and I need to install other things to it. So in this nugget, we're going to spend some time talking about how you go about configuring hardware and software inventory. That is done inside of the client settings location. And we're going to spend literally like 15 seconds talking about the extension of that hardware inventory. There are three ways to do it, really four ways to do it. One has been baked now into the console. Makes things much, much easier for extending it. But I can also go a little bit further with this configuration.mof and then IDMIFs and no IDMIFs. I will not go into much detail on those because they are very, very, very advanced. We'll talk about configuring asset intelligence, and also we're going to begin the process of creating collections, which are some very basic direct membership collections. So let's take a minute and take a look at really what we've already done as it relates to inventory in the system that we've created. Back here on config mgr1, taking a look again at the configuration manager console. I have my server here, which is config manager 1, and it's got all the roles on it now because, well, it's receiving data from all the systems that are out there. So under client settings, we looked at these earlier, but we want to take another look at them again because we want to take a look at the hardware inventory and software inventory piece of client settings. Now, hardware inventory is enabled by default. Every 7 days, your clients are going to send up a snapshot of what their hardware inventory is up to the config manager server, and it'll use it to populate the database. And that's okay. Your hardware doesn't change that much. So who cares if you add another stick of RAM? You're probably not generating reports that need that level of granularity of data. Now, what's interesting is the hardware inventory on the clients it's essentially the data that you can gather anyway inside WMI. Like if I take a look at, for example, this computer, and I take a look at WMI, I can do so from the command line with the command line tool wmic. wmic will give me essentially, and I forget what the command is. There it is. Will give me essentially a command line interface into all of the different classes that are out there. You know, if I want to find out, for example, I don't know, I want to find out the memory cache. What's the cache memory management settings that are out there? Or even the partition information. I can do so by typing in memory cache, and partition, for example. There we go. Partition. So it'll show me that, all right, there's the block size, there's bootable, there's the boot partition, and here's the caption associated with that. If you play with PowerShell too, PowerShell will do this. You can use PowerShell to get this information right out of WMI. VBScript has been able to do it forever. But WMI is effectively just this giant store of configuration information that the hardware inventory is interrogating for all these specifics. So when we go back here to hardware inventory, I want to turn this on, set the schedule, and usually keep this maximum custom MIF file the same because most of us don't use custom MIFs. And then choose whether or not I want to collect these MIF files. So hold that thought because I have to explain a couple of things first before we get into customizing this. So let's say that I've gone about and collected a bunch of hardware information. Here inside of my devices node, I can take a look at one of my servers, right-click it, choose to start the resource exploder, and here under hardware I can see, well, a much more graphically friendly view of all that stuff. So let's take a look here at disk partitions. So we saw that just a minute ago. Oop, there we go. Disk 0, partition 0, name 1, primary partition equal to 1. There's the size. Some other information there for partitions. Network adapter stuff. Well, there's all my network adapters. Here are my power settings, all the different power states that are available. Here's the physical memory state. So these are all the characteristics that are being collected from those systems by virtue of that, that hardware inventory. Sometimes, sometimes maybe I want to get another piece of data out of that. The default hardware inventory is not enough for what I'm looking for. I'm going to create a report on some other piece of data. This new item here, set classes, allows me to extend my hardware inventory to add additional functionality. This used to be a lot harder to do. Now, if I want to, for example, get direct memory or device memory access stuff, I just add that right into the things that I'm inventorying. And there's a whole list of new hardware stuff that I can inventory here, pointer devices and print jobs and so on and so forth, that I can add in to the hardware inventory I want to add. Choose the add button here, and I can even add in, well, additional inventory classes if I see fit. So if I have another namespace on another piece of hardware, well, I can identify what classes are on that piece of hardware. Maybe some software is installed something, or a piece of hardware is installed some other class to manage itself. Well, then I can add that to my list of things to add. This, back in the old days, used to be done with a tool called configuration.mof. And back in the old days, this was a much more challenging process to go through. In fact, in order to do that, the configuration mof file was found in C program files, configuration manager, that was SMS back then, inboxes and CLI files, hidden for hardware inventory, and there's that configuration.mof. This is a text-based file that I can use and view. It's human readable for additional things that I want to gather on my clients. Doing so here requires a little bit of programming. I mean, you've got to know, all right, I want the registry provider, and the class I'm looking for is in HT local machine, and there's the path. And here are the items that I want to gather out of that and make sure all of my syntax is appropriate here. So if for some reason you can't figure out how to do it in the pleasant GUI interface, well, configuration.mof presents a second solution for you as well. Now, I don't want to spend much time talking about IDMIFs and no IDMIFs, other than the fact that you can control here in hardware inventory whether or not you're going to collect them or not, and which ones you want. What these are files that you would store in the Windows directory in the CCM inventory, either IDMIFs or no IDMIFs folder on the client. And these files would contain specific information about devices or other items that are not necessarily collected by default. And some are called ID MIFs because they contain a unique ID, and some are called no ID MIFs because they don't contain a unique ID. But the idea here is that, I don't know, you have a shared network printer, a DVD player, a photocopy, or some sort of other device that is connected that you want to make sure that Configuration Manager collects, and you can't gather it through any other solution. So you generate the file, drop it onto that computer, and then as long as it's on that computer, well, it'll get captured by Config Manager. So again, very, very, very advanced here. Very advanced stuff. And there are third-party tools that leverage the use of MIF and MOF files, so or MIF files, so that it can gather this additional information. Just be aware that they're there. Now, with this hardware inventory is also a software inventory. And, you know, when you think about it from a WMI perspective, it's all the same thing. I'm just querying another class in WMI where all this software stuff is. But really, the software inventory is a very separate process. That process then goes every 7 days by default to gather the software inventory on clients, to provide whatever detail is necessary, and then to inventory the different properties, the metadata associated with files on those computers. We're not collecting the files. We're not gathering all the files and putting them into a central location. No, that'd be a very bad thing. That's a large number of files. But what we're doing is inventorying specific file types across the different computers in our Config Manager infrastructure. Commonly, the files that we want to collect will be things like star.exes, potentially also star.dlls. Right? These allow me to identify, okay, I'm looking for the properties associated with each executable file and each DLL file on all of my systems. What's the version number? What's the path? What's the name of the file? When was it last touched? When was it last adjusted? These become handy because this inventory metadata can then be used in creating collections so you can find out where software exists. Remember, I've got discovery information that tells me about the computers, which allows me to create or collect inventory information, which I can then pass into Asset Intelligence to turn it into usable data. So for example, if I may be doing star.exes here, but maybe I want to figure out, okay, where does, I don't know, winword.exe exist? I could do that. Now obviously this will get captured by the star.exe filter here, but I could add other things in here. Maybe I have a particular OCX file, whatever.ocx that I want, if it exists, on a client to actually gather the metadata associated with that file. Okay. Again, just like before, don't add anything in here unless you plan on using it for the purposes of managing systems. You don't want to go and add a bunch of OCX files into your database if you're not going to do anything with it. So again, XEs and DLLs, fairly common. I think back in the old days, actually, XEs may have been installed by default or collected by default. This bottom item down here is extremely dangerous. In fact, think twice before you actually turn this on. I told you that the idea of software inventory is that I want to be able to collect the metadata associated with files on those systems. But occasionally there comes a time when, I don't know, I got a file, maybe it's an INI file, and there's specific data in that INI file, and I want to collect not just the metadata associated with the file, but the actual file itself. Obviously, you can see where this can become really awful really fast. So when I set a configure the collect files setting here, I'm actually collecting the actual file. I can put a limit on it down here. Okay, if it's larger than 128K, multiply that by 10,000 clients in my infrastructure, that's a lot of space I've got to set aside. So use this, but use it very, very sparingly and very, very carefully as well. Now the bottom item down here allows you to set some names. So this is an artifact of a time long, long past when the skies were not nearly as shining blue as they are today, back in the old SMS days, when we would collect metadata from various files and need to translate that metadata into actual file names. Sounds familiar to asset intelligence, doesn't it? Well, before asset intelligence, if we had inventoried names that would come across in all of these different possible combinations, well, we want to normalize that data down to, well, just that. Out of the box, this is all you get. You can add your own in here if you want. Most people don't do this. It's just around because it's always been around. A lot of this stuff gets captured by asset intelligence, or you may have a third-party tool. There are a number of them out there that do an even better job than the built-in asset intelligence. So, I don't know, maybe you want to create a new display name for, create a new inventory name, and if it's, I don't know, WinZip, then I'd want to, on top, set the display name to the appropriate WinZip, or WinZip Pro to WinZip. You see where I'm going here. The items down here get normalized to the items up on top. I can do that for manufacturer or also for product. So these two items identify what the software inventory is. I'm going to click OK here so I can start collecting on XEs and DLLs. This will come in handy a little later on when we start talking about querying. In fact, we've got an upcoming nugget here, I believe it's next, where we're going to start doing some queries based off of the data that we've collected. Now, ultimately, all this stuff, like all of these activities, are here because what we want to do is create collections of devices or users. So let's look at the old school device collections here. Again, the end state is performing some action on these clients. But I have to collect those clients into a group in order to perform those actions. The big power in Config Manager is creating collections that are not based necessarily on some static, computer name, but instead on the different characteristics of computers that you want to deploy to. I'm not interested in deploying to, ER12345, 12346, 12347, those asset tags. I'm interested in deploying Office 2010 to every computer currently running Office 2007. See where I'm going with this. Now, I will talk more about the more dynamic device collections that you'll create in the next nugget. But what I want to do is show you how you can create some very standard, some very simple collections using what's called direct membership. So let's create a collection, and we'll call this Config Manager Servers. When I create a collection, I have to limit it to another collection. I can do that to all systems, or all desktop and server clients, for example. Let's set it to all systems. Now, when I do that, I have to define a membership rule for that collection. So that membership rule can either be a direct rule, a query rule, or can include and exclude other collections. The query rule is the much more fully featured solution. It also is very dynamic, so as things change, your collection membership will change. Direct rules are, you are specifically targeting specific devices. Choose Next. Here, for example, in the resource class System Resource, I want to choose the name of the computer, and the name of the computer is Config MGR1. I can exclude certain resources for different reasons here. When I choose Next, there's the resource I want. Choose Next again, and close, and I have created now a membership rule that all it does is point at a specific server by server name. Not terribly useful. Right? I'm creating this collection called Config Manager Servers, but if I have a new Config Manager server, well, I got to go back in and adjust the membership rules. So again, these are very simple direct membership collections. My recommendation to you is to never, ever, ever, ever use them. Occasionally you need to. You got one machine you got to address. But for the most part, 95% of the time you're going to want to use query-based rules as opposed to this. So when I create that collection, I can use incremental updates here as opposed to full updates. It just makes the process of updating the collection much faster. Again, one server here, so it shouldn't matter. When I'm done, that collection gets created, and you'll see here I now have a collection called Config Manager Servers. And if I view its membership up here at the top, well, its membership is that server config mgr1. Not terrifically exciting. This will become far, far, far more exciting a little bit later on when we start talking about query-based stuff. So I'm actually going to remove this collection because I want to cement into your mind that you should not use these direct membership collections. It's not what Config Manager is all about. Now what we have to do, however, the last task, at least in this nugget, is really taking a look at the third step in this process, which is going from discovery to inventory to asset intelligence information. Now, just like it says, asset intelligence is adding intelligence to the asset information that we're collecting through our inventory data. So discovery, inventory, asset intelligence. What's surprising about asset intelligence, and what a lot of people actually get confused about, is that most of where it gets its data from is actually the hardware inventory. So hardware inventory collects a bunch of data, right? That data includes information about, for example, the files that are on a system. It may also include which executables are used by specific users or specific computers. But that information all by itself is really raw. When you think about it, right? If I'm collecting winword.exe, I might be collecting, well, the name of the file and the version number of that file and maybe some other metadata when it was last touched. But what I really want is to know that winword.exe corresponds to Microsoft Windows version 2010, so on and so forth. In order to turn on asset intelligence, one of the first things you have to do is actually here under sites, or excuse me, under servers, is to add the asset intelligence, what we call the synchronization point. You'll notice I've already done that here. Adding the point is relatively trivial. Now, the synchronization point, the whole concept of this is that there are some number of applications that Microsoft is aware of that exist in the world. And those applications, there's somewhere almost like 700,000 applications at this point. Those applications, they sit up at Microsoft. The synchronization point then goes and queries Microsoft for that content, brings it down so that you can create here inside of your internal database, so you can create that mapping between the data you have and the intelligence that you want to get out of that data. Now, I will warn you that at this point in where we're at in this series, we're not going to see much out of asset intelligence just yet. We've got the synchronization point here, and if we go up here to assets and compliance, you'll see that that component's been enabled. It is connected to the online service. We've actually, one of the reasons why I installed it was so that I could get a download so that you could see verifiably that it works. And that it's set up on a synchronization schedule. And yours will be set up probably every 7 days. Mine I've got set up for every day so I can churn that data. You'll notice here that it has actually, in its last synchronization, downloaded some 666,000 software titles from Microsoft. So there's a pretty substantial amount of stuff that actually gets downloaded. Once it's installed, the next step is to actually edit the inventory classes. These are, again, hardware inventory classes that you actually want to collect on. So you'll notice here that by default we have system console usage and system console user are brought down, or actually are monitored. What we're doing here is adjusting which of these various classes inside of really WMI are being collected by SMS. So we can install or we can collect, for example, installed software. Which software is set to auto start, which browser helper objects are out there, which software shortcuts are out there. And you'll notice if I highlight over these, the reports that can ultimately be created from this data get exposed. So you can turn all these on, and it'll give you a warning here if you try to turn them all on that, well, there's a lot of CPU usage that will happen during the hardware inventory cycle. But you can turn them all on, and it will actually bring down some pretty substantial information about the applications that are being used in your environment and really what they are, more so than just file metadata. When you do turn these things on, though, that's really one of the first steps. In fact, you'll find that right when you turn it on, there's nothing in your inventory software. You've got to get through some hardware cycles first, and the system has to churn through many of the various timeouts before you'll actually begin to get data in here. Once you do get data, however, you'll be able to pull that data out of reporting, which we'll talk about a little bit later under monitoring. A couple of things you have to do first. Okay? We talked about installing that asset intelligence synchronization point. We talked about also up here editing the inventory classes and also completing a synchronization. If you intend on gathering reports that are associated with, for example, user logon issues, there's a little bit of an adjustment that you have to make to your default domain policy. You're going to want to enable auditing for success logon events. And in fact, I've got that already set up over here on that computer DC, the domain controller. And if you'll take a look here, this is the default domain policy. And here under computer configuration, Windows settings, security settings, local policy, audit policy, you'll want to enable audit logon events for success events. The SMS client, so the config manager client on the individual machine, is going to use the information that it gathers out of that event log to help you identify, well, which users are logging on to which computers. So useful information here. And again, this is something that needs to be done to the default domain policy. So those are really kind of the steps that have to happen. There is also one entry back here in the Config Manager console that allows you to import in software licenses. And this is honestly kind of an interesting little tool that we have now. So if you create a little CSV file of the licenses that you have, and I'm not going to get into much detail here because you can read about this. It's a fairly advanced topic. What you can do is create a license statement that maps the applications that Asset Intelligence finds to, well, whatever set of licenses you have. And you set that all in a CSV file, you upload it, and it will keep kind of track of how many licenses for these custom pieces of software that you're actually consuming. So useful little tool here. Just again, we would have to create CSV files, and that's a level of detail that kind of goes beyond where I want to get to at this point. But that's kind of the steps that are required to get Asset Intelligence running. And there is one more step that's required to get it completely up and running, and that is actually to enable software metering. And we're not going to get to that for a couple of nuggets left, so I don't want to get too much into software metering. But at this point, like I said, we've got some of the basic settings built now to get Asset Intelligence up and running. Once we get metering turned on, once we get the reporting point turned on, we'll actually begin collecting some of the information down here at the bottom for what software we've actually inventoried off of our systems. But for now, that's kind of the basics of getting it set up, and we'll see more about it as we get a little bit further along in this series. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about collecting inventory and that process of creating simple collections. Pretty cool, huh? You know, creating simple collections is very easy, but they're not very powerful. I think in the next nugget, really going to begin to truly appreciate really the power of Configuration Manager as it relates to deploying software and updates and configurations out to the different machines on your network. We talked about that whole discovery, then inventory, then asset intelligence process, and then we spent just a minute talking about collections. Okay, collections are the objects that contain devices or users that you tell to do things. Then in the interaction portion, we configured the hardware-software inventory. We set it up in client settings, talked a bit about the extension process, which has gotten much easier with that little button and the nice GUI screens. Spent just a minute on asset intelligence and actually spent some time creating a very simple direct membership collection. Coming up next is a big focus on queries. So if it's the end of the day, I would recommend waiting until tomorrow when you're fresh to watch that next video, because you got to have your good, well caffeinated brain on, because the next video, the next nugget on queries is perhaps the most powerful of the nuggets, but it's also the most challenging to understand. So get your thinking cap on, because in that next nugget, we're going to spend some time doing some really awesome stuff. Until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.